On January 15, 1974, 4 members of the Otero family were found dead in their Wichita, Kansas home. The father, mother, and 2 of their children had been bound and strangled. The killer had cut the phone lines, entered through the back door, and spent hours in that house. 3 older Otero children came home from school that afternoon to discover a scene that would haunt them forever. But this was only the beginning. Over the next 17 years, 6 more people would lose their lives to the same killer. He taunted police with letters, signing them with 3 letters that would become infamous: BTK, beaned, torture, kill. He sent detailed descriptions of his crimes to newspapers, included drawings and photographs, and seemed to delight in the terror he created. Then, in 1991, he simply vanished. This was Wichita in the 1970s and 80s. A quiet, Midwestern city of modest homes and tree-lined streets where people left their doors unlocked at night and neighbors knew each other by name. It was the kind of place where children rode their bikes until dark and parents did not worry, where trust was the default setting. But BTK changed all that forever. Fear crept into homes across the city like a poison. People installed new locks, invested in security systems, kept loaded guns by their bedsides, and looked over their shoulders when walking to their cars. And the killer? The man who was creating all this fear and paranoia? He was the one installing those very same security systems, the one entering people's homes under the guise of making them safer. This is the story of Dennis Rader, the BTK Killer, a husband and father of 2, a church council president, a Boy Scout leader, an Air Force veteran, a compliance officer who cited people for overgrown lawns. By day, he was the definition of suburban normalcy. By night, he lived out violent fantasies that would claim 10 lives and terrorize an entire city for 3 decades. To understand how one man could lead such a complete double life, how he evaded capture for over 30 years, and how his own ego would ultimately lead to his downfall, we have to go back to a cold winter morning in 1974, when the Otero family moved to Wichita, hoping for a fresh start. Dennis Lynn Rader was born on March 9, 1945, in Pittsburgh, Kansas, a small town in the southeastern corner of the state. He was the oldest of 4 sons in what appeared to be a typical Midwestern family. His father, William Elvin Rader, was a former United States Marine who worked for Kansas Gas Service. His mother, Dorothea May, was a bookkeeper. The family attended Zion Lutheran Church in Pittsburgh, where young Dennis was baptized. By all outward appearances, Dennis had a perfectly normal childhood, filled with fishing trips, comic books, and scout activities. But beneath the surface, something was very wrong. Rader later admitted that as a youth, he tortured and killed small animals. He would hang stray cats and reportedly derived pleasure from their suffering. He developed violent sexual fantasies involving bondage and domination. These dark impulses remained completely hidden from his family, his friends, and everyone around him. He learned early how to compartmentalize, how to present one face to the world while nurturing something entirely different inside. He was good at hiding. It was a skill he would perfect over the next several decades. The Rader family eventually moved to Wichita, where Dennis would spend most of his life. He struggled academically and dropped out of college before eventually finding his path into the military. In the mid-1960s, Rader joined the United States Air Force. He served honorably and was discharged in 1970. He returned to Wichita, where he briefly worked as an assembler for the Coleman Company, a camping equipment manufacturer. In May of 1971, he married Paula Dietz, a secretary, in a ceremony at Christ Lutheran Church. They seemed like any other young couple starting their lives together. In 1974, Rader began working for ADT Security Services, installing home security alarms. The job gave him access to hundreds of homes across Wichita. He learned floor plans, alarm systems, entry points. His co-workers called him Blue Book Man because he rigidly followed every rule and reprimanded others for even minor infractions. He was meticulous, organized, and completely unremarkable. That same year, 1974, Paula gave birth to their first child, a son named Brian. From the outside, Dennis Rader was living the American dream. A steady job, a wife, a new baby, a home in a quiet neighborhood. But inside, something was building. His fantasies were no longer enough. He needed more. He began what he called trolling, walking or driving through neighborhoods, looking for what he referred to as projects. These were potential victims, women mostly. He would follow them, learn their routines, study their homes. He was methodical, patient. He created what he called a hit kit, containing rope, tape, knives, and other tools. He kept detailed lists and drawings. He planned everything. In December of 1973, he had spotted Julie Otero and her 11-year-old daughter Josephine while out walking. The Otero family had moved to Wichita just 6 months earlier. Joseph Otero, the father, was a former Air Force pilot. Julie, the mother, was a devoted Catholic woman. They had 5 children. The 3 oldest attended school. The 2 youngest, 9-year-old Joey and 11-year-old Josephine, stayed home that morning. On the morning of January 15th, 1974, Dennis Rader gathered his carefully prepared hit kit and drove to the Otero home on North Edgemore Street. He cut the phone lines with wire cutters and entered through the back door, finding it unlocked, as so many doors were in Wichita in those days. When he encountered Joseph Otero still at home instead of at work as he had expected, he had to improvise quickly. He pulled a gun and told the family an elaborate lie. He said he was wanted by the law, that he was on the run and desperate, that he just needed food, some money, and a car to get out of town, and that he would not hurt them if they cooperated. The Otero family, kind and trusting, believed him. They thought if they cooperated, they would survive. He ordered them to lie face down on the living room floor and began binding them with cord he had brought in his kit. Joseph, Julie, 9-year-old Joey, and 11-year-old Josephine all complied, believing they were helping a desperate man who would soon be gone. Only when Rader started to strangle Joseph Otero did the family realize they had been terribly, fatally deceived. One by one, methodically and without mercy, Rader killed them all. Joseph first, then Julie, who he had to strangle twice because he was inexperienced and uncertain. Young Joey was next, and finally, 11-year-old Josephine, who he forced down to the basement, placed a noose around her neck, and hanged from a pipe. Before he left the house, he took items as souvenirs to remember this day: a watch, a radio, personal belongings. Then he calmly drove away in the family car, abandoning it in a supermarket parking lot and throwing the keys onto the roof of a nearby building. That afternoon, around 3:30, 15-year-old Charlie Otero and his siblings Danny and Carmen came home from school, expecting a normal day. What they discovered when they walked through the door would shatter their lives forever. would change them in ways that could never be undone. Charlie later described the moment as having his heart physically ripped from his chest, leaving a wound that would never fully heal. 3 months passed after the Otero murders. Wichita police had no solid leads. The crime scene had been meticulously processed, evidence had been collected and cataloged, but the killer had left frustratingly little behind that could identify him. Detectives interviewed hundreds of people. They followed every tip, no matter how unlikely. But nothing led them closer to the killer. Then, on April 4th, 1974, he struck again. Catherine Bright was a 21-year-old woman who worked at the Coleman Company, the same place where Rader had briefly been employed. On that April afternoon, Rader broke into her home and was waiting when Catherine arrived with her 19-year-old brother, Kevin. Rader forced them both at gunpoint, binding them with rope. But this time, something went wrong. Kevin Bright fought back. During the struggle, Rader shot Kevin in the face, but Kevin survived and managed to escape to get help. Meanwhile, Rader turned on Catherine. She did not survive the attack. Kevin Bright's survival meant that police now had an eyewitness, a description. But it still was not enough to identify the killer. 9 months after the Otero murders, in October of 1974, an anonymous phone call was placed to the Wichita Eagle newspaper. The caller's voice was calm, almost casual, as he directed them to a specific mechanical engineering textbook in the public library. Inside that book, tucked between the pages, police found a letter. It claimed responsibility for the Otero murders and promised that more killings would follow. The letter contained details about the crime scene that had never been released to the public, details that only the killer could have known, confirming beyond doubt that this was authentic. This was the beginning of BTK's correspondence with authorities and the media. In that first letter, he had given himself a name. He explained what the letter stood for in chilling detail. Bind them, torture them, kill them, BTK. He wrote that he had done this before and would do it again. He seemed to relish the attention, the fear he was creating, the power he held over an entire city. This was not just about the killings themselves. This was about recognition, about being known, about proving he was smarter than everyone trying to catch him. For the next 3 years, BTK continued his hunt through the neighborhoods of Wichita. On March 17, 1977, he killed Shirley Vian, a 24-year-old mother of 3 young children. In an act of calculated cruelty, he locked her children in a bathroom, telling them to be quiet and stay put before strangling their mother in another room. On December 8, 1977, just 2 days after her 21st birthday, he killed Nancy Fox in her apartment. After Nancy's death, Rader called the police from a payphone, his voice calm and matter-of-fact as he directed them to the crime scene and admitted he was responsible for her death. Wichita was gripped by paralyzing fear, unlike anything the city had experienced before. Women installed multiple deadbolts on their doors and windows. Gun sales increased dramatically across the city. People stopped answering their doors to strangers. Neighborhood watch programs formed almost overnight. Parents walked their children to school. The police department was overwhelmed with tips and worked around the clock. But despite their best efforts, they seemed no closer to catching him. BTK was always one step ahead. He knew police procedures inside and out. He understood forensics and how to avoid leaving evidence. Some investigators began to speculate that he might have formal training in criminal justice, that he might even be studying the very techniques being used to hunt him. Then, in 1979, after Nancy Fox's murder, the letters stopped. The killing stopped. BTK went silent. Police waited for the next victim, the next letter, but nothing came. Days turned into weeks, weeks into months, months into years. The case grew cold. While Wichita held its collective breath and waited for the next attack, Dennis Rader continued living his meticulously normal life. In 1978, his daughter Carrie was born, completing his family. He was now a father of 2 children who would grow up knowing nothing of their father's dark secret. He attended church every Sunday at Christ Lutheran Church, where he not only served on the congregation council, but eventually became its president. He helped lead his son's Cub Scout troop, taking boys on camping trips and teaching them skills. Neighbors knew him as quiet, helpful, perhaps a bit rigid and overly particular about rules, but certainly not someone to fear, certainly not a monster. In 1979, Rader graduated from Wichita State University with a degree in administration of justice. He had spent years studying criminal justice, learning about forensics and investigative techniques, all while actively committing the very crimes he was studying how to solve. The same year he graduated, he began transitioning away from ADT security services, eventually leaving the company in 1988. In 1991, he took a position as a compliance officer for Park City, Kansas, a small suburb just north of Wichita. As a compliance officer, Rader was notorious throughout Park City for his strict, almost obsessive enforcement of city ordinances. He measured grass height with a ruler, issuing citations if lawns exceeded the allowed length by even a fraction of an inch. He took photographs of minor infractions and created detailed reports. He was aggressive in his approach, sometimes confrontational, and seemed to take genuine pleasure in wielding even the smallest amount of authority over others. People in Park City knew him as difficult, petty, and hard to deal with. But no one suspected that this nitpicking bureaucrat was capable of murder. But BTK had not stopped. The silence from 1979 did not mean he had stopped killing. During his so-called cooling off period, Rader continued to feed his obsession in other ways. He took photographs of himself wearing women's clothing and bondage gear, posing as his victims. He kept detailed journals, drawings, and records of his crimes. He fantasized about future victims. And then he killed again. In April of 1985, he murdered Maureen Hedge, a 53-year-old neighbor who lived just a few houses away from him. In September of 1986, he strangled 28-year-old Vicki Wegerle in her home while her 2-year-old son was present. The child was not harmed, but for years, this murder was not definitively linked to BTK. On January 19, 1991, Rader abducted 62-year-old Dolores Davis from her home. Her body was found 13 days later under a bridge. She had been strangled, her body positioned in a specific way. This would be his last known victim. After 1991, BTK went silent again, but this time the silence would last 13 years. Investigators assumed he was either dead, imprisoned for another crime, or had found some other outlet for his violent urges. The case files gathered dust, families grieved without answers, and Dennis Rader went about his life, raising his children, working his job, attending church. In 2004, a local newspaper ran a feature story marking the 30th anniversary of the Otero murders. The headline read, "BTK Case Unsolved, 30 Years Later." The article speculated that the killer was likely dead or in prison. Dennis Rader read that article at his desk in the Park City compliance office. He later admitted he was kind of bored and decided it was time to remind everyone that BTK was still out there. In March of 2004, the Wichita Eagle received a letter from someone calling himself Bill Thomas Kilman. The letter claimed responsibility for the Vicki Wegerle murder from 1986. Enclosed were photographs of the crime scene and a photocopy of Vicki's driver's license, which had been stolen at the time of her death. Police immediately formed a task force. Lieutenant Ken Landwehr, a veteran detective who had worked the original cases, led the investigation. The BTK task force included members of the Wichita Police Department, the Kansas Bureau of Investigation, and the FBI. They knew they were dealing with someone who craved attention and recognition. Over the next year, BTK sent multiple communications to various media outlets and law enforcement agencies. He left packages carefully taped to stop signs at specific intersections around Wichita. He dropped items wrapped in plastic bags into library return slots after hours. He mailed materials directly to television stations with specific instructions for how they should cover his story. Each communication contained more evidence, more details about the crimes, more taunting messages designed to prove his superiority. He sent chapter headings for a proposed book he wanted to write called The BTK Story. He included disturbing drawings that depicted his crimes. He sent photographs of himself in bondage poses. He was showing off, proving that he was still out there, still smarter than everyone trying to catch him. The task force worked methodically, analyzing every communication, looking for patterns, searching for the one mistake that would reveal his identity. They brought in behavioral analysts from the FBI. They consulted with forensic psychologists. They knew they were dealing with someone whose need for attention and recognition might eventually override his caution. In January of 2005, police received a package that included a note. BTK asked a question. If he sent police a floppy disk, would they be able to trace it back to him? Police responded through a classified ad in the newspaper. "Rex, it will be okay." It was a lie. On February 16, 2005, a purple floppy disk was found in a drop box at a Home Depot. Police gave it to Randy Stone, a computer forensics expert. Within minutes, Stone discovered that the disk had been used at Christ Lutheran Church and had last been accessed by someone named Dennis. A quick internet search revealed that the president of Christ Lutheran Church was Dennis Rader. Meanwhile, police had preserved DNA evidence from the Wegerle crime scene. They needed a sample to compare it to, but they could not approach Rader directly without alerting him. Investigators learned that Rader's daughter, Carrie, had recently been to the hospital. They obtained a subpoena for her medical records and received a sample of her DNA from a PAP smear test. The results showed a familial match to the DNA from the crime scene. On February 25, 2005, Dennis Rader left his compliance office for lunch. As he drove toward home, police vehicles surrounded him. An officer approached. "Mr. Rader, do you know why you're going downtown?" Rader replied, "Oh, I have suspicions why." At a press conference the next morning, Wichita Police Chief Norman Williams announced, "The bottom line, BTK is arrested." Dennis Rader's arrest sent shockwaves through Wichita and beyond. The compliance officer who had measured people's lawns was one of America's most wanted serial killers. His wife immediately filed for emergency divorce. His children learned that their father, the man who had raised them, coached them, attended their school events, was responsible for 10 murders. Rader initially pleaded not guilty, but quickly changed his plea. On June 27, 2005, he stood in court and pleaded guilty to 10 counts of first-degree murder. What followed was chilling. Judge Greg Waller asked Rader to describe each murder in detail. For nearly an hour, Rader calmly recounted his crimes. He spoke in a flat, emotionless tone, describing the bindings he used, the methods of strangulation, the fear in his victims' eyes. He referred to them as projects. He explained his sexual fantasies. He showed no remorse. Families of the victims sat in the courtroom and listened. Charlie Otero heard for the first time exactly how his family had died. He heard Rader describe his mother's last words. "May God forgive you for that." It broke his heart all over again. The two-day sentencing hearing included testimony from investigators, emotional statements from victims' families, and a bizarre statement from Rader himself. He listed things he claimed to have in common with his victims: an interest in drawing, gardening, writing poetry. It was a narcissistic display that highlighted his complete lack of empathy. Because Kansas had abolished the death penalty in 1972 and did not reinstate it until 1994, Rader was ineligible for execution. The judge sentenced him to 10 consecutive life sentences, a minimum of 175 years without the possibility of parole. Dennis Rader was transported to the El Dorado Correctional Facility in Butler County, Kansas, where he remains today. He is now 79 years old. In 2019, his daughter Carrie published a book about her experience titled "A Serial Killer's Daughter: My Story of Faith, Love, and Overcoming." She has publicly stated that she has forgiven her father, but still struggles to reconcile the man who raised her with the monster he truly was. In recent years, investigators have examined Rader's drawings and writings for potential links to other unsolved cases. In 2023, authorities in Oklahoma named him as a prime suspect in the disappearance of a 16-year-old girl who went missing in 1976, though this has not been conclusively proven. Rader's daughter believes her father likely committed more than 10 murders. The BTK case stands as a stark and sobering reminder that evil does not always announce itself with obvious warning signs. Dennis Rader was not the stereotypical monster lurking in the shadows of dark alleys. He was not the outsider, the drifter, the obvious suspect. He was the neighbor who waved pleasantly from his front lawn while mowing in precise rows. The church member who never missed a Sunday service and sat in the same pew every week. The father who attended his children's school events and helped with their homework. The compliance officer who drove around Park City in a city vehicle, enforcing rules and maintaining order. He hid in plain sight for over 30 years, protected by the absolute normalcy and ordinariness of his everyday life. His family, his co-workers, his neighbors, the people who saw him every single day, had no idea. The investigation that finally caught him was a masterclass in patience, strategy, and psychological manipulation. Lieutenant Ken Landwehr and his dedicated task force played an extraordinarily careful game, feeding Rader's massive ego while methodically gathering the evidence they needed. When Rader asked if a floppy disk could be traced back to its user, they deliberately lied to him. They told him exactly what he wanted to hear, what his narcissism needed to believe, and his absolute certainty that he was smarter than everyone else. His unwavering belief that he could outsmart law enforcement one more time led him to trust that lie. That single decision would be his downfall. 10 families lost loved ones to BTK: Joseph, Julie, Joey, and Josephine Otero, Catherine Bright, Shirley Vian, Nancy Fox, Maureen Hedge, Vicky Wegerle, Dolores Davis. Behind each name is a life cut short, a family forever changed, a community forever scarred. They deserve to be remembered not for how they died, but for how they lived. The BTK case changed how law enforcement approaches cold cases. It demonstrated the value of preserving DNA evidence, even when technology to analyze it does not yet exist. It showed the importance of never giving up, of keeping files open, of waiting for the one mistake every criminal eventually makes. Dennis Rader made that mistake when he decided his story needed to be told, when he believed the world had forgotten about BTK, when his ego demanded attention one more time. That decision led to his arrest, his conviction, and ensured he will spend the rest of his life behind bars. Today, Rader sits in a maximum security prison, his notoriety the only thing left of the power he once wielded. The families he destroyed continue to heal, to remember their loved ones, and to find strength in survival. And Wichita, the city he terrorized for 3 decades, has reclaimed the sense of safety he tried so hard to take away.